I should have locked the door. I should have drawn the curtain. I should have done 100 things differently that evening, but I didn't, and now the most powerful man in the entire kingdom, King Nana Kouasant, is standing outside my small wooden door after midnight, and my foolish, treacherous heart is running faster than sense, faster than fear, faster than every warning my mind is screaming at me, because I am Kofi Mensah, just a cook, the youngest head cook this palace has ever employed, and I have been secretly, silently, hopelessly in love with this man for 3 years, without ever saying a single word. And now the universe has decided to test every wall I've ever built around that secret in the most devastating way possible. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how a young man from a village ends up standing half-dressed in the palace gardens with a king who cannot stop looking at him. Because this story doesn't start with a kiss or a confession. It starts with a bathing shelter, a golden evening, and one moment of silence that changed everything. Kofi Mensah woke before the sun every single day without exception, because the palace kitchen was his entire world. The smell of palm soup curling through the early morning air, the satisfying hiss of hot oil meeting fresh ingredients, the quiet pride of feeding an entire royal household without a single complaint from anyone. And at 28 years old, he wore the title of youngest head cook in palace history like a medal nobody else could see, quietly, privately. With a dignity that cost him nothing, because he had earned every inch of it through years of pre-dawn mornings and calloused hands and recipes passed down from a grandmother who believed that food was not just fuel but feeling. And then there was the king. King Nana Kouasant, 37 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw carved from patience and eyes that held the weight of an entire kingdom in them. Married to Queen Abina Serwa, who was graceful and intelligent and beloved by every person in the land, untouchable in every way that mattered and in every way that didn't. And Kofi had spent 3 years learning to love him the way you love the sun, which means from a distance, carefully, never staring too long. Never letting the warmth trick you into thinking you could reach out and hold it. That Tuesday evening after a long shift, Kofi slipped behind the eastern wing to the small bathing shelter the staff used when the main quarters were occupied, and the evening light was golden and the compound was quiet, and he had checked. He had absolutely checked that no one was around, and he undressed and poured the first bowl of cool water over his shoulders, and exhaled the kind of exhale that only happens when you have finally put down a weight you have been carrying all day. He did not hear the footsteps. King Ku had taken a rare evening walk, the kind his advisors always discouraged, because kings are not supposed to wander without purpose or protection, and he turned the corner of the eastern wing without thinking and stopped, and Kofi turned at the sound of gravel shifting beneath leather sandals, and their eyes met, and the entire world held its breath for a count of 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Kofi moved fast, reaching for his cloth, pressing it to his body, his face burning with something that existed exactly halfway between shame and pure animal panic, and he dropped to one knee the way he had been trained, head bowed, heart hammering so loudly in his ears that he was absolutely certain the king could hear it too. "Your Majesty, forgive me, I did not know. Stand up." Ku's voice was quiet, not cold, not angry, just quiet in the specific way that feels more dangerous than any shouting ever could. And Kofi stood with the cloth clutched against him and his eyes fixed somewhere near the king's feet, because looking up felt like a risk he couldn't calculate. He could feel the king's gaze on him like a hand on his skin, steady and unhurried, and it lasted 3 seconds longer than any accidental glance has any right to last. 3 seconds that Kofi would replay in his mind every single night for weeks afterward. "The Eastern Walk is not restricted to staff," Ku said finally. "You did nothing wrong." Kofi nodded without speaking because he did not trust his mouth to produce anything sensible. The king didn't move. It was the strange part, the part that Kofi would later identify as the exact moment everything changed. Because kings turned and walked away, that was what they did when encounters like this happened. They dismissed and forgot and moved on, but Ku stood there in his loose evening cloth with the golden light cutting sharp across his face, and he looked at Kofi the way a man looks when he is trying to memorize something he is afraid he might lose. "What is your name?" Kofi blinked. "Kofi, Your Majesty, head cook." "I know who you are," a pause that stretched thin as silk. "I asked your name." "Kofi," he repeated, softer this time. Ku nodded slowly as though the name meant something now that he had received it properly and personally, and then finally he turned and walked back the way he came, and Kofi stood frozen in place until the sound of footsteps on gravel disappeared entirely. Then he sat down on the bathing stool with the cloth still gripped to his chest and stared at the ground, and told himself with great firmness that it meant nothing, that the king had simply been surprised, that the long look was nothing, that the almost tender quality in that quiet voice was nothing, and he repeated this to himself until his pulse slowed, and he did not believe a single word of it. 3 days passed. Kofi cooked and served and moved through the palace like a ghost, wearing a calm face, and he told no one because there was genuinely nothing to tell. The king had looked at him. That was all. except that it wasn't all, and he knew it wasn't all, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone he kept trying to ignore. On the fourth day, the king requested his evening meal be brought to his private reading room rather than the dining hall, which was not unusual. Kings changed their preferences all the time, but the instruction that followed was unusual. The head cook should bring it personally. Kofi stood in the kitchen reading the note twice while Ama, his young kitchen assistant, leaned over his shoulder and grinned with the uncomplicated delight of someone who didn't understand the weight of what she was looking at. "The king likes your cooking," she said. "The king eats my cooking every day," Kofi said, folding the note with careful hands. "He has never asked me to bring it. He went anyway because what else could he do?" And the private reading room smelled of old paper and cedar and quiet authority, and Ku was standing at the window when Kofi entered, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the courtyard below with the particular stillness of a man who is thinking about something he hasn't said out loud yet. Kofi set the tray down carefully, pepper soup, soft kenki, garden eggs, and a clay pot, and announced it the way he always did. "Your Majesty, your evening meal. Sit." Kofi looked at the empty chair across from the king's reading desk, and his entire body registered it as a trap. It would not be appropriate. "I am not asking you to share the meal." Ku turned from the window with an expression that was almost patient. "I am asking you to sit. There is a difference." Kofi sat. Ku returned to his chair and lifted the clay pot lid and breathed in the steam rising from the surface, and a small real smile crossed his face, the kind of smile Kofi had only ever seen from across a crowded hall, the kind that looked like it belonged to a different, simpler man. "I have eaten in 4 different countries," Ku said. "No one makes pepper soup the way you do." "My grandmother taught me," Kofi said, and something about the simplicity of the question pulled a real answer out of him before he could think better of it. "She believed a soup should feel like something, like it has intention." Ku looked at him with those eyes that held kingdoms. "And what is the intention tonight?" Kofi's throat tightened around the answer before he gave it. "Warmth," he said quietly, "just warmth." The king held his gaze one beat too long, then looked down at his bowl. "Then it is perfect," he said. Kofi walked back to the kitchen afterwards and said nothing to anyone, but his hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the weight of the tray. It started as a knock, a gentle one, almost hesitant, against Kofi's small staff quarters door at 10 on a Thursday night. And Kofi sat up from his mat with his heart immediately awake even though the rest of him wasn't, and he opened the door, and King Ku stood in plain dark cloth with no guards and no attendants, just a man at a door looking slightly uncertain, and on a king's face that expression looked almost impossible and completely disarming at the same time. "I couldn't sleep," Ku said. Kofi stared at him because that was perhaps the least royal excuse he had ever heard in his life. "May I come in?" Ku added. Kofi stepped aside. The room was modest in the way that a cook's room is modest. A mat, a small table, a stool, a window. No decoration fit for any kind of company, let alone the company of a king. But Ku sat on the wooden stool without complaint and looked around slowly, like the simplicity of the space was itself interesting to him, like he had forgotten rooms could look like this. "Do you not have counselors to talk to?" Kofi asked carefully, wrapping a cloth around his shoulders against the night air. "They give me answers," Ku said. "I wanted conversation." They talked for an hour about food and about childhood, and about the weight of roles you inherit rather than choose. And Ku spoke about his father's expectations, with a weariness he clearly kept locked away during daylight hours. And Kofi told him about growing up in the village and cooking for his younger siblings on the nights when his mother worked late. And at some point, they both moved to the mat and the distance between them became a deliberate thing, a conscious choice. Both men aware of exactly how much space remained between their shoulders, and choosing together not to close it. Before he left, Ku stood at the door and looked at Kofi the way he had beside the bathing shelter, that same steady memorizing look, and said thank you, just that, nothing more. And Kofi closed the door gently and sat back on his mat and pressed his palms flat against his knees, and tried to name what was happening inside his chest, and couldn't, and somewhere deep inside him something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened its eyes. Kofi began to dread the nights, not because he didn't want them to come, but because he wanted them too much, which is a specific and particular kind of torture that anyone who has ever loved someone they shouldn't has felt in their bones. Ku came back, not every night at first, but often enough that Kofi's body began to listen for footsteps after the palace quieted, began to recognize the specific rhythm of that particular walk on gravel, and they talked in low voices and laughed quietly and carefully the way men do when they have found something precious and fragile and they both know it, and some nights they said almost nothing at all. Just sat close in the dark sharing silence, the way you can only share silence with someone you trust completely, except Kofi knew better than to call it safe, because nothing about this was safe, nothing about this had ever been safe, and he knew it. One night, Ku reached over and adjusted the cloth that had slipped off Kofi's shoulder. A small thing, a nothing thing, a gesture of the most ordinary human consideration, except his hand lingered a half second past what fixing a cloth required, fingers warm against Kofi's collarbone, and neither man pretended they hadn't noticed, because pretending had become impossible somewhere in the middle of all these quiet nights. Kofi stood abruptly and put space between them, his voice low and strained when he spoke. "This isn't right." Ku looked at him with a calmness that was almost infuriating. "No," he agreed simply, "it isn't. You are the king," Kofi said, pressing his fingers to his forehead. "You have a queen, I am your cook. This cannot become what it is becoming." "And what is it becoming?" Ku asked quietly, and Kofi looked at this man who carried an entire kingdom on his shoulders and came to a cook's door because he couldn't sleep, and felt something in his chest fracture quietly. Something neither of us can afford. Ku rose slowly the way he did everything, with a measured heavy grace that made every movement look like a decision, and he stopped in front of Kofi, close but not touching, and said, "I have spent 17 years being exactly what everyone needed me to be. I have never once asked for what I needed," and those words landed in Kofi's chest soft and devastating and perfectly aimed, because they mirrored his own hidden life so precisely that for a moment he couldn't breathe. Ku left without touching him again, but the air in the room after he was gone felt charged like the space between lightning and thunder where time stretches, and everything feels possible and impossible at once, and Kofi sat alone in the dark and tried very hard not to hope, and was not entirely successful. They found a place, a bench beneath the old mango tree at the far end of the palace garden, past the herb plots, past the yam storage, past every place the groundskeepers went after dark, and it became theirs without anyone naming it that, and they went separately, always 10 minutes apart, and they left separately too, a careful choreography, practiced and precise. But here is the thing about careful people, they still make mistakes. The first kiss happened on a Wednesday. Kofi could never afterwards say who moved first, only that the conversation had grown quiet and the night had grown warm, and when he turned his head, Ku was already there, close and still, looking at him like a question he had been holding for weeks. And it was brief and tentative, and the softest possible collision of two lives that had absolutely no business touching. And when they separated, they both sat very still and stared at the dark garden and said nothing for a long time. Kofi's heart was a drum line. Ku exhaled like a man setting down something he had been carrying for years. "Kofi," he said softly. "Don't," Kofi replied, not unkindly, "just don't name it yet. Let it exist 1 minute without needing to be explained." So they sat under the mango tree and let it be what it was, a secret and a wonder and a weight, and the most alive either of them had felt in longer than they could say. The nights that followed were warmer, a hand held in the dark, foreheads pressed together, quiet words exchanged in the space where royalty and simplicity had no meaning and two men were just two men, and one evening Ku traced the line of Kofi's jaw with 2 fingers, something reverent in the gesture, and said, "I did not know I could feel this." Kofi caught his hand gently, held it still. Neither did I. They didn't hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the far path. They didn't see the shadow pause behind the hibiscus hedge. They didn't know that someone else now held what they had tried so carefully to keep, and that the world they had built in the dark under that mango tree was already ending. Her name was Akosua, and she had served Queen Abina for 11 years with the specific loyalty of old wood, quietly, stubbornly, without question. And she went to the queen the very next morning and said it plainly, because the queen had told her years ago to always say things plainly. Abina Serwa was at her vanity braiding her hair with the slow, practiced patience of a woman who has learned to move through life without hurry, and she watched Akosua's reflection in the mirror, the tight jaw, the lowered eyes, and said, "Say it plainly." And Akosua said it, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with shock, because the queen's face didn't fracture the way a surprised person's face fractures. It settled, like something long braced for had finally arrived, under the mango tree. Abina asked, "Yes, your majesty, the cook, Kofi Mensah." "Yes." She dismissed Akosua gently and kindly the way she did everything, and when the door closed, she sat for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap looking at her own reflection. And she was not a cruel woman. She was not even, she realized, a deeply wounded one. What she felt was something quieter and sadder, the ache of a woman who had shared 17 years with a man she respected deeply and could never truly reach, and she had told herself the distance was his nature. And now she understood it was a door he had kept locked, not from her out of cruelty, but because he had kept it locked even from himself, for decades alone. She rose and straightened her cloth and walked to the king's chamber with the dignity of a woman who has already decided how she will carry herself through this. And Ku was reading when she entered, and he looked up and something shifted behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, something older and more tired than guilt, something cornered and afraid, and Abina sat across from him and folded her hands and said, "We need to speak about Kofi." The king set his book down and did not ask how she knew, and did not deny anything, and simply looked at his wife. And for the first time in 17 years, they were completely, devastatingly honest with each other. Ku had faced councils and droughts and border disputes and the deaths of people he loved, and none of it had unmade him the way this conversation did, because Abina was not screaming, and that was somehow so much worse. She spoke with the careful steadiness of a woman who had decided in the moments before entering the room to remain whole no matter what she heard. "How long?" she asked. "Not long," Ku said. "Nothing, we haven't." He stopped. "It has been weeks, the feeling's longer." "The feeling's longer," she repeated, not mocking, just confirming, needing it to be true and spoken. "How much longer?" He looked at his hands. "Always," he said, "in one way or another, always." Abina closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them they were clear. "Does he love you?" The question surprised him, and he considered it honestly the way she deserved. "I think so, yes, and you?" He didn't answer immediately, and that silence was itself an answer, and they both knew it. "Then yes." Abina stood and walked to the window and looked out at the palace grounds where guards stood at their posts, and birds moved through the frangipani trees, and two children of a palace official chased a dog across the path. Everything ordinary, everything as it should look, nothing as it actually was. "I have been a good queen," she said, not as a boast, as a quiet statement of fact. "You have been an extraordinary queen," Ku said, and he meant it with everything he had. "None of this is your failure, none of it, not a single piece of it." "I know," she said. "I also know that if this becomes public it destroys everything, your legacy, the court's trust, the people's faith." She turned to face him. "And I know that you know this too." Ku said nothing. "Kofi cannot stay," Abina said, and the words landed between them like stone dropped into still water. "He leaves quietly, with dignity and with provisions, or this is handled publicly and he is disgraced." And her voice was not cruel. It was the voice of a queen doing the hardest calculus of her reign with as much mercy as the situation would allow. "I will give him the choice, but he cannot stay." Ku sat in his chair long after she left, and for the first time in 37 years of life, the king wept. Queen Abina came to Kofi herself with no guards and no announcement, and Kofi was in the kitchen when the kitchen girl Adoa whispered that the queen was at the back door, and Kofi's blood turned to ice in his veins. He walked out to meet her with flour still on his hands, which he realized too late and rubbed uselessly against his apron, and Abina looked at him, truly looked at him, and in that moment Kofi understood completely why the king had married her, because there was no smallness in this woman. Even delivering something devastating, she managed to remain kind. "I am not here to shame you," she said. "I need you to hear me with clear ears." She laid it out simply. Leave tonight, quietly, with a parcel of money enough to set him up far from the capital and start a new life, or remain and be formally removed. The matter made public, his name a scandal, his family marked by it. Kofi stared at the ground between them for a long moment. "Does he know you are here?" "He knows the outcome," she said, "not this conversation." Kofi nodded slowly, and something in him that had known this was coming since the very first knock on his door breathed out a long, slow breath of resignation. Because he had known, hadn't he? He had always known. There was no version of this story where he stayed. Men like him did not get to keep kings. That was not how the world was written. That had never been how the world was written. "I'll leave tonight," he said quietly. Abina was quiet for a moment, and then she gave him something he hadn't expected. "He loves you," she said. "I want you to know that I saw it clearly. What you are is not a small thing." She paused. "It is simply an impossible one." Kofi pressed his lips together hard because he would not cry in front of the queen. "I know," he managed. She left him a wrapped parcel, and she did not look back. And Kofi stood in the kitchen where he had cooked 1,000 meals and lit 1,000 fires, and built something he was quietly proud of, and began to gather the only things that were truly his. Kofi left before midnight with one bag, a change of cloth, his grandmother's wooden spoon, and the parcel the queen had given him, and he walked through the eastern gate the same way he had come in 3 years ago, unremarkable and unhurried, a young man with a trade and nowhere particular to belong. He did not look back at the palace. If he had, he would have seen the light in the private reading room still burning, because Ku was standing at that window, had been standing there since the hour when he knew Kofi would be leaving, unable to go to him and unable to make it harder and unable to make a promise he was not free to keep. All he could do was stand at the glass and watch the gate and breathe through the kind of pain that has no name in any language he had ever been taught. And he stayed there until the light changed and the gate was still, and the garden was empty and there was nothing left to watch. In the kitchen the next morning a new cook was assigned and they were competent, and the food was fine and the king ate without comment, and no one noticed that he barely tasted anything at all. And Abina watched her husband across the breakfast table, the absence behind his eyes, the particular set of his jaw that meant he was holding something in. And she had done what she had to do, and she did not regret the decision, and she did, however, grieve for all three of them in the quiet, private way. She grieved most things, completely and alone. Kofi on the road heading north stopped once at a wayside stall and ate wakai from a banana leaf, ordinary food, simple food, the kind of food that belongs to normal life, and he thought about how he had cooked for a king, how a king had come to his door in the dark, how under a mango tree a man powerful enough to hold an entire world had held him gently instead, and he would build a life, he knew that. He would cook again and find his footing and be fine in all the ways that matter and several of the ways that don't. But he would never be untouched by it, because the love of a king, even a brief one, even a secret one, even one that ends at a quiet gate with a single bag and a wooden spoon, leaves a mark that time does not fade. And in a palace behind him, a handsome king sat on his throne and looked at nothing and quietly, completely agreed.